Well, now we're going to hear from Mike Poe. Mike is a senior research manager at the Preservation Green Lab National Trust for Historic Preservation. Dr. Poe leads research efforts empirically assessing the contributions that existing buildings in commercial districts offer communities. With his colleagues, Mike recently completed work on the Green Lab's Older, Smaller, Better project, which used maps and statistics to demonstrate the critical role that older, smaller buildings play in supporting the social, cultural, and economic vitality of urban neighborhoods. At the Green Lab, Mike is part of a team that aims to unlock the inherent strengths of old buildings to save natural resources and strengthen local economies. Mike holds a Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree and a doctorate in Planning Policy and Design, both from the University of California, Irvine. He has worked as a researcher and community development professional in Texas, California, Florida, and Washington. Mike, thank you very much. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Well, okay. So, yeah, thank you, John. And I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit differently than Tom did. So I'm going to focus on some research that the Preservation Green Lab has led over the last few years that I think really connects to this topic of why old places matter. So the Preservation Green Lab is sort of like the research and development arm of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We are a small team of 5 people scattered across the country. And this idea of research and development, we're sort of, trying to develop the new tools that are going to support preservation and building reuse into the 21st century. So sort of the new tools for an old subject and a sort of a historic subject, preservation. But we're really focused on the intersection between sustainability and preservation. We do a lot of research and advocacy that basically tries to support the environmental argument for building reuse, as well as the sort of social and economic performance aspects. We really believe that old buildings play an important role in strengthening neighborhoods and strong local economies. So that's part of what we do. We're also recently getting involved with some climate change conversation. Hopefully I have some time to talk about that. So actually, yeah, one of the first reports we're really known for was one called The Greenest Building. So there's an architect named Carlo Lafonte who famously said the greenest building is one that already exists. And it's sort of a nice, snappy headline, but we want to know to what extent that's really true statistically. So we looked at several different building types, several different climate areas, climate zones across the country, and found that it can take between 10 and 80 years for even a new kind of LEED quality, energy efficient building to overcome those impacts associated with demolition of an existing building and new construction. So building reuse is oftentimes the more sensitive and smart approach to sort of addressing climate change goals. Now, a lot of our work since then is focused on how we can sort of drive energy efficiency towards old buildings. So we produced a report, you can see the cover on the left there, Saving Windows, Saving Money, basically focused on how you can retrofit existing windows and still get as good or better performance, especially on a per dollar spent kind of effort. Oftentimes you don't need to rip out your old windows. This is a sticking point in a lot of preservation conversations. And then we did this national sort of scope analysis to see how many small commercial buildings are there across the country. We found that there's about 95% of the total commercial square foot, commercial buildings across the country are smaller than 50,000 square feet. And that represents 4.4 million small buildings and about 5.9 million small businesses. So it's a huge sort of swath, a huge set of buildings across the country. This is really notable, though, because these sort of small commercial buildings are individually unique, and they have their own sort of eccentricities and their own histories. So whereas an energy efficiency kind of green building person could come in and agree to retrofit a portfolio of public buildings, publicly owned buildings, or schools, or someone might come into a large building and try to get a lot of savings out of one building. These small commercial buildings, even though they suffer some of the same kinds of problems, are harder to sort of treat, right? So we actually were partially driven to do this because we think there's a great opportunity. And our America Saves project here on the next slide basically is about driving retrofits to those small commercial buildings. So we got $2 million for a 3-year project from the Department of Energy to look at how we can work through Main Street organizations and other sort of local sort of district scale governance organizations, so eco districts, chambers of commerce, that kind of thing. So work with those organizations, those people who know the business owners and the building owners, and try to really drive these energy efficiency retrofits. So we're using some remote auditing tools, we're gathering some data, we're actually delivering these new reports that basically say good, better, best. Here are the things you can do to sort of retrofit your building, make it more energy efficient, and really help the bottom line for that business and that building and keep that building in use, the ultimate goal. So that's sort of one thread. The other major thread of our work is sort of demonstrating the value, demonstrating why old places matter, you could say, and advocating for the reuse of existing structures. So we're really trying to broaden the scope of what preservation is and what it can be by showing what a big difference these places make and what building reuse can mean for sort of sustainability goals and for like just great places. So I'm really going to focus on these 2 reports and primarily the one on the left, Older, Smaller, Better, which is a report we put out last year. So Older, Smaller, Better really, I think, builds on the legacy that Jane Jacobs created. Jane Jacobs published a book in 1961 called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she sort of had a lot to say about what city planning was doing at the time, kind of lobbed a lot of accusations, and I think a lot of them landed pretty squarely. Jane Jacobs isn't really considered a preservationist. I don't think preservationists really as a movement sort of think of Jane Jacobs as one of our own. But I think her sort of the spirit of her work is really alive in the Green Lab's work and certainly in Older, Smaller, Better. So Jane Jacobs, among other things, said that cities need old buildings so badly it's probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. And she said maybe more famously that old ideas can sometimes use new buildings, but that new ideas need old buildings. She said that we need a mix of old and new structures to sort of have a resilient sort of economic ecosystem. Now you could fast forward 50 years and contrast what Jane Jacobs wrote with a guy named Ed Glaeser. Ed Glaeser is an economist at Harvard, a really smart guy, obviously. But he wrote a book called The Triumph of the City, which basically, it said a lot of nice things about cities that I think we can all sort of agree on. You know, cities are innovative, they're sort of font of creativity for people, they're dense, they're diverse. But he sort of picked a fight with preservationists as well. He said that preservation necessarily is about restricting supply of space. And by restricting construction, you sort of limit supply and therefore drive up the price, you know, the cost of living in the city. And, you know, I'm not here to tell you that the laws of, you know, the basic laws of economics are wrong, that supply and demand don't work that way. I think, you know, Ed Glaeser is probably right in the end, but there's a lot missing, a lot of nuance missing from his argument. So Older, Smaller, Better is really about sort of digging into that and trying to see, you know, what does Ed Glaeser's sort of simple supply and demand argument miss? You know, what is the value of these places? Why do these older, smaller buildings matter? So we actually thought to test Jane Jacobs' hypothesis that having a mix of old and new buildings sort of portends better neighborhood outcomes. We used a variety of data to measure and sort of compare building characteristics to the social, cultural, and sort of economic vitality of neighborhoods. In this report, we looked at Seattle, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. We've since added Tucson, Arizona, and we're actually rolling this out to many more cities now. So I hope you can see the animation on the right. This is actually one of the cooler pieces of data that we got to use in this project was intensity of cell phone activity from basically this is running a loop from 12:01 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. So on a Friday. So one of the things we can do is isolate the intensity of cell phone activity in different parts of the city at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. And lo and behold, where do you find the greatest intensity of cell phone activity on 10 o'clock on a Friday, but where you have a mix of old and new buildings? So it's kind of surprising, but it's, it's one of these things that we had the opportunity to do with this data. So we measured things, took data from the census, from the Center for Economic Studies at the Census Bureau. We took data from some private websites like WalkScore and Craigslist and Flickr, data on real estate performance from the local assessor, a ton of different data. But I want to show you quickly how we did this. So this is Seattle. That last map, the animation was DC, by the way, Washington, DC. So this is Seattle. There's about 12,500, if you overlay a grid over the city, about 12,500 200 meter by 200 meter grid squares. This is about the size of a square block or block and a half. And so for each of these 12,500 grid squares, we can tell you a bunch of different things. Most notably, we can tell you the median age of the buildings on that grid square, the diversity of building age, so the standard deviation of year constructed, and the granularity, so sort of how many buildings are crammed into each of those grid squares. So in older, smaller, better, we actually focused on only the mixed use and commercial corridors, which represents, I think, about 4,500 or 5,000 grid squares across the city. We were interested in economic performance, so we isolated our model on just those orange squares. So one of the things we did was actually create this new composite measure. We standardized our measure of median building age, of diversity of building age, of granularity, and we actually combined those and created something we're calling a character score. So the red and orange squares on the far right on the composite have older, smaller buildings and a mix of old and new buildings. And blue and sort of green grid squares have predominantly new, large structures. One thing we can do with this sort of analysis with character score is we can kind of split the city down the middle and say, so on the one hand, you have the red squares, which are sort of older, smaller, mixed vintage. In blue, you have newer, larger, less age diverse. So we can look at the averages for different measures on one hand and on the other. So for instance, the average walk score is about 5.5 points higher where you have this older, smaller, mixed vintage fabric. It's pretty striking, all the focus we've given to sort of walkability and active living by city planners and architects and designers over the last 20 years, yet we're still not performing, our new buildings aren't performing as well as the old stuff in cities. So I wanted to show you just sort of why do old places matter? What does older, smaller, better say about all this, about how all this kind of comes together? So the first one I've already sort of alluded to, older mixed-use neighborhoods are more walkable. And I think this is one that's sort of obvious a little bit, maybe a little bit of a warm-up to these findings. Because basically where you have buildings that came out of the ground before cars were a ubiquitous sort of component of city life, of course those areas are going to be more walkable. So we looked at walk score and transit score and found that they were significantly higher in Seattle and San Francisco, where you have high character score areas. Okay, next finding. So this is one that I think is sort of surprising and sort of funny. So we say young people love old buildings. We've actually measured the median age. We took census data on the median age of residents at every area of the city and found that the median age of residents is significantly lower where you have older, smaller buildings and mixed vintage blocks, where you have this kind of fabric. That sort of surprised me. I'm a fairly young guy myself. I think I'm one of the oldest end of the millennial set. But I wouldn't have thought that this would necessarily come to be. Sometimes people will say to me, that's a nice, cute headline, Mike, but it's not. Young people don't love the old buildings. They love the cheap rent that comes along with the old buildings. And I always sort of say, okay, yeah, you're helping me make the argument for me, because old buildings are necessarily sort of the naturally affordable stock of space in a city. When we talk about affordable housing, I think we often mean sort of city or government-sponsored housing or nonprofit housing. But there's actually this market-based housing, just these old buildings that have cheaper rents, overlooked often. Actually, I wanted to say one other thing while I'm on this slide. So at the last minute before releasing this report, we actually looked at another measure. We looked at the diversity of the age of residents, not just the age of buildings. So how much is there a mix of people from different sort of stages of life where you have older, smaller buildings? Turns out there's significantly greater diversity of young and old residents where you have this type of fabric as well. And actually this builds on the American Planning Association last year did a national survey of boomers and millennials, the two largest generations in American history, and found that these two groups actually express a strong preference for walkable environments. So really clear connection, I think, here between the old fabric, walkability, and young and old alike. So I already alluded to this one a little bit, nightlife being most alive on streets with a diverse range of building age. The intensity of cell phone activity, 10 o'clock on a Friday night, is significantly higher in Seattle, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., where you have a mix of old and new buildings. An astute sort of observer will note that the slide here says San Francisco and D.C. comprise or have greater nightlife. Turns out that in Seattle, it's the character score measure. So the actual older, smaller mixed vintage is a significant predictor of higher intensity of cell phone activity. We actually also looked at some other cultural measures. For instance, we looked at permits pulled for seating outside cafes and coffee shops, and found that actually they're significantly more likely to see one of those permits where you have this kind of older fabric. Sort of makes sense. So you have more active sidewalks generally where you have these kinds of buildings. So building on work of a guy named Richard Florida and others on sort of the important role that creative occupations and the creative class play in urban economies, we singled out creative jobs. We looked at jobs in arts, entertainment, recreation, information, I think professional, scientific, technical fields, sort of a decent measure of creative jobs. Found that there are significantly greater concentrations of those jobs per commercial square foot, where you have these older, smaller buildings and mixed vintage blocks. That was true in Seattle and Washington, D.C. And then the finding that I think is sort of most important to me about all this, it's great to have walkable environments, but I really care about sort of the diversity of life and how sort of it supports the local economy. I think the next two slides, next couple of headlines really get at this. But so we found that in Seattle and Washington, D.C., there's actually significantly higher proportions of new businesses launched in the previous year, and women and minority-owned businesses. And if you can remember one thing from this presentation, remember that there's, on average, more than twice the rate of women and minority ownership of businesses in Seattle, where you have this kind of older, more age-diverse and fine-grained building stock. 19.2% compared to 9.5%, where you have newer, larger, less age-diverse buildings. And, we can talk about why this is in question and answer. I think it has to do with, oftentimes when you build a new building, you need to find tenants that have, that can sign long leases, that have long lines of credit, have a lot of money in the bank. Oftentimes that's more likely, Quiznos than, one of a kind, a sandwich shop or deli that's based in your neighborhood or your city. Pretty interesting. And actually building right from that, so older, smaller buildings provide space for a strong local economy. I mean, when's the last time you had someone in town visiting you from outside your hometown or your city, and you took them, the whole time to an AMC theaters or, all the chain restaurants, or Walmart? I think oftentimes we take people to the places that are sort of distinctive and have sort of one of a kind, something that's unique to the city about them. So this is absolutely what we found. So we actually found there are significantly higher percentages of non-chain businesses and small businesses where you have a combination of small, old, and new buildings, where you have this high character score, sort of character-rich fabric. Old places matter partially because they sort of afford opportunities for small businesses like this, and they sort of create these environments that are not the same as those you find in one city and then the next and then the next. And then this last headline sort of goes right back to Ed Glazer, that economist, that talked about supply and demand. So we actually found that older commercial and mixed-use districts contain hidden density. So the founder of the Green Lab, one of the co-founders of the Green Lab, a woman named Liz Dunn, who's a real estate developer, she likes to say that older, smaller buildings punch above their weight class. but they actually, so per square foot, these places have significantly more businesses per commercial square foot and more jobs per commercial square foot. So, you know, if we measure things, we compared a 60-floor office tower in downtown Seattle to a 3-floor sort of walk-up. Of course, there are going to be more jobs and businesses in the tower, right? It's not really a fair comparison. But if you level the playing field and you say on a per commercial square foot basis, where is there more activity? It actually flips every time. So you have significantly greater sort of concentrations. These are hubs or hives of sort of commercial activity and entrepreneurial spirit. We actually also found that there are significantly greater population density where you have older, smaller buildings. And I think this is another one that sort of, you have to kind of scratch your head and think about it for a minute. But as you start to think about, you know, the size of bedrooms and the way that parking is incorporated into buildings, I think you could start to understand, you know, the size of lawns, you know, how much residual space is around the building. You can start to see how actually there's greater population density where you have this kind of this old fabric. So it's not as simple as Ed Glazer's and people like Ed Glazer are necessarily making it out to be. So in Seattle, about 37% more jobs per square foot, where you have this high character sport fabric. So key findings, you know, where you have this kind of fabric, you have greater walkability, you have younger residents, you have a greater mix of young and old residents, greater nightlife, all kinds of great economic measures on sort of density of activity economically, and certain characteristics of the businesses, that women and minority-owned businesses, you know, really important findings. So all that's to say, these are a lot of reasons why old places matter. But what can we really kind of do about it, I think, is what we're going to turn to now. So I think the sort of key takeaway, you know, I'm not going to belabor this, but Jane Jacobs was right, you know, where you older, smaller buildings and the mix of old new buildings really, our findings really all seem to point to those building characteristics really playing a big part in a strong local economy, great neighborhood, great place. So what can we sort of do? Where you have great old buildings, you know, and they're really working well, and you know, it's an attractive place that people love, maybe think about more of a preservation approach. So sort of how can you make sure that you retain that character, that you sort of keep that place going, and you don't let the sort of market kill itself. You don't let the sort of coolness of the neighborhood sort of be self-destructive. So maybe preservation, sort of landmarking, maybe these are the kinds of things you want to do in a place like this. We actually have done a lot of analysis though at the Green Lab and found that you're never really going to get that far with landmarking, right? Most cities have between 3 and 5% of their buildings are designated in some way, whether on the National Register or locally landmarked. Whereas, you know, in a lot of cases, 50, 60, even 70% of the buildings were constructed before 1945. So we have a huge set of buildings across cities that are old and distinctive, but aren't probably ever going to sort of receive the treatment from the classic preservation tools. So in these kinds of places where you have these great old buildings, these great bones, but the neighborhood's not really popping, maybe encouraging reuse and infill, maybe, you know, sort of thinking critically about how you can make building reuse a more attractive option for developers. So maybe stripping away parking requirements, or sort of trying to work through building code issues so that simply retrofitting an old building to keep it in use doesn't necessarily mean you have to make it function like a new building and meet current code, the code for new buildings. Just one approach. And then last, don't be afraid to mix the old and the new. You know, our findings really point to, you know, this idea that something magical happens where you have a mix of old and new structures. You just need to be kind of smart about the design and kind of have some sort of consistent sort of character and feel of the place. This is, I think, from San Francisco, I believe in South of Market, this picture. So that's sort of the report, older, smaller, better, hearing what Donovan Rippon has to say next.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I think there's a couple questions that people would like to pose. Give me a moment here.
Yeah, sure.
So, Mike, if someone owns a building, say, for example, a 19th century drugstore, general store in a small town, and they have possibility to be used as, say, welcome center or some other commercial use, where would one start? Do they go to historical societies, small business organizations, chambers of commerce, housing commissions? Where would they start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, you could go to the local preservation organization if your city or town has one. I think that's often going to be a good place to find some resources. You could certainly reach out to the National Trust. You could go reach out to your state historic preservation office, what we call SHPOs. They'll have a lot of information. And yeah, I think historic societies, I think small business associations, chambers of commerce, I think all of these things are sort of great directions to go. I would say, though, that, the sort of base isn't always there in towns. And sometimes I think you have to be a little entrepreneurial and sort of reach out to people in other communities and sort of find solutions and be a leader in this subject. It's important.
And also, earlier in your presentation, you had talked about that there's double the rate of minority and women employment existing in these older, smaller, better places. Does your study address the correlation and why that exists?
Well, so yeah, good question. Yeah, we found more than twice the rate of women in minority ownership of businesses in these areas. And I think our study does not, we used spatial regression analysis, and we looked at things, alongside the building characteristics. We looked at income levels and transit accessibility and permit activity. But at the end of the day, even a regression analysis like that is still just really looking at sort of sophisticated measures of correlation. Not causation. So, but we know from looking back to Jane Jacobs' work, to looking at other sort of researchers, I think it really stands to reason. Actually, talking to a lot of real estate developers now, it really stands to reason. Makes a lot of sense that oftentimes these local businesses, women and minority-owned businesses, small businesses, don't have the long line of credit. They don't have as much sort of reserve in the bank. And when you build something new, you often require that, whereas these older, smaller buildings are more likely to be sort of locally owned, and there's more likely to be relationships at play between business owner and building owner. I think there's a little more responsiveness to what the neighborhood sort of needs and desires are sometimes. I think you're more likely to see greater representation of, the actual demographics of the community and the business ownership. So for all these reasons, I think it sort of makes sense. But the initial research just shows us that it happens. It doesn't show us how and why it happens. You had to sort of connect the dots there.
Okay. And lastly, especially in light of the one portion of your talk where you addressed neighborhoods in transition, and I guess this really relates to any of the older, smaller, better places. Have you looked at how important the roles of governments, all levels of governments, play in keeping these old buildings and places vibrant?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, places like Los Angeles and Phoenix, these are two cities that are sort of exemplars in sort of building reuse policy. Both these cities have adaptive reuse ordinances and programs that really are all about trying to make it easier to reuse these buildings. And I think you're seeing great outcomes in both of those cities. Downtown LA, I think, added something like 14,000 residents over the last 15 years in its downtown by just reusing the historic buildings and its historic core. And that was through the adaptive reuse ordinance passed in 1999. I think it led to something like 60 building rehabs. In Phoenix, they have a citywide adaptive reuse program, and I was just in Phoenix a couple weeks ago, and it just blew me away. They have some beautiful mid-century buildings, not beautiful necessarily in the sort of preservation sense, although I think there's probably some consensus there. But these are, they're old. They're banks from the 50s. Sometimes they're even like a kind of early strip mall development, but they're being reused for all these cool purposes and all these cool ways. So I think those are two exemplars. State historic tax credits, I think, play a huge part in sort of making building reuse a more attractive option, something that you can actually make pencil as a developer. At the federal level, I think there are sort of fewer policies. I think a lot of the innovation, a lot of the good stuff is happening at the local level. But the federal historic tax credit, I think, is so important for making this happen as well. So, yeah, I think government absolutely can help. I think especially at the local level, there's a lot more innovation. There's a lot more that cities can do. And I think this is actually something we're going to start to see. Cities are looking for competitive advantages to sort of attract good development, and sort of create these walkable neighborhoods. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer to city officials that older buildings play a role there, and sort of supporting building reuse makes a lot of sense for that strategy.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very in-depth analysis of a lot of data. It's very interesting how you synthesize those data for those character scores. And I thank you so much for sharing that with us.
A lot of fun with it.
Oh, yes. So do you have any closing thoughts for those that are viewing this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope you guys kind of get how all this points to why old places matter. I think Tom and Donovan sort of make the connection a little bit more explicit, maybe, but absolutely, I think there's strong research here to back all this up. I also did want to put in a little bit of a plug, if I could. The National Trust is actually having its national conference in D.C. this year. I don't know if anyone out there is from D.C., but I believe it's November 3rd through 6th. It's called Past Forward 2015. I think it's going to be a really great conference, and I'd love for people to be on the lookout for that.
Okay, well, again, thank you, Mike. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much. Great to talk to you.
And that is where I'm going to cut it.
Great. I think I maybe talked longer this time. I hope I didn't go too long. No,
I think it's good. It's actually fine for home viewing, if you will, to go a little bit longer than when we're live. So it's kind of good.
People can always fast forward me as they choose.
Right. And they have the ability to rewind you, so that's always good.
Yeah.
All right, sir. I definitely thank you so much for being able to do this again with us.
Yeah, sure. No big deal. Glad to help.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.